Rise of Hawk, Part 4, Scene 29. There was the boom of an explosion downstairs. It didn't sound particularly big, but Barney guessed it was probably the rebels. He ripped a length of material from the lining of his leather jacket. Zack lay unconscious on the ground in front of him. The boy had lost a lot of blood from where a bullet had ripped through the top of his arm, but it only damaged skin and muscle. It was a messy wound and would probably leave an interesting scar, but it looked as if everything affected would grow back again. Barney wrapped the material around his wound and carefully knotted it to stem the bleeding. The boy was covered in bullet grazes and burns, but only the arm had been hit. He'd lost one shoe, and the dark grey rags that served as his t-shirt were filled with little burn and rip holes from bullets that had missed him. Zack wasn't particularly badly injured, so the shock of pain, blood loss, and being attacked had probably been the cause of him passing out, though the boy had tried to fight it before he fainted. Barney smiled. Zack definitely had the stones for combat despite his age. If he was Barney's son, he'd be very proud of the brave young man. Barney? Talon's voice was scattered oddly at the edges, but clearer than before. He sat upright and looked towards the door. Yeah, what's going on? I heard an explosion. That was Lalana at the front door. We're in the building. How are you two? I'm fine. Zack's been shot. He'll be okay, but he's unconscious. We're fairly secure in the upstairs room, northeast corner. Talon sounded tense. Okay, as long as Zack's unconscious, stay where you are. We're making a path through the building to you. Righto. Scene break. Asha and Lalane stood either side of the blackened doorway, their backs to the stone. The smell of burnt chemicals and smoke surrounded Asha. It took some focus for her not to cough from the acrid smell. They were ready to go inside, but simply waiting for a clear signal from Talon. Asha couldn't sense much of anything, even with physical contact with the stone. Her kinetic ability was more about force and less about spatial senses compared to her brother's skill. As much as she didn't want Talon there in case he was killed or injured, they couldn't have pulled off that style of attack without his talent for getting around the side suppressant in the walls. Gunfire sounded through the doorway next to them. Ronin hand cannons seemed to argue with the smaller Iranan weapons. There was silence for a few moments, and she sensed her brother connect to her mind. Clear. His mental voice was kind of scattered and patchy, like a slightly out-of-tune radio signal, but it was strong. She tapped her weapon. When Lil glanced back at her, Asha signalled with one hand for her to go in first. Lalane lifted her weapon and stepped in through the doorway. Half a breath later, Asha followed her. A smoky haze hovered above them, closer to the ceiling, and at least 5 bodies lay sprawled in different positions across the stone parlour floor. Asha glanced sideways at Lalane. She felt a half-suppressed sadness, but nothing that would indicate Lil might switch sides. Across the massive parlour stood her brother and Nama with their backs to a wall. Both men looked tense but uninjured. There's 3 more bodies in the dining room, said Nama in a quiet but clear voice. Okay, secure the... Traitor! A gunshot fired from above them, and next to Asha, Lalane dropped to the ground. Lifting a weapon to start firing, Asha skittered sideways towards a nearby doorway at the foot of the stairs. Bullets followed her as she ran, until finally one of her shots hit their target. The woman on the balcony above her cried out in pain and fell back. Asha stood in the cover of a doorway, panting. A shaft of pain cut its way through her shoulder and up into her neck. She had been hit, and, judging by the building agony, the bullet had broken her collarbone. Sothen, she swore. Asha? I'm all right, she barked. Edging around the door frame, she glanced above her. The body was unmoving, and she sensed nothing from the figure, so they were likely badly injured or dead. She couldn't see or feel anyone else. She lifted her weapon to aim at the balcony. Nama, she barked again. Get the explosives. Tay, check on Lil. I'll cover you. The 2 men moved immediately. Nama turned towards the far doorway, and Tay ran to where Lalane lay on the ground in front of the entrance. She watched the balcony, concentrating on staying upright through the pain of the gunshot wound. She's alive. Tay's voice was clipped and tense. She swallowed and lifted her gun arm up some more. Glad to hear it. Can you sense anyone else in the house? He sighed. No, but I thought it was clear before, too. Her knees weakened under her, and she felt herself slipping slowly to the floor. Usher! I'm all right, she croaked as her gun hand dropped as well. Just need to sit, is all. She couldn't really think any more. The agony and a terrible spinning in her head were dragging her down. Her eyes closed. Usher, stay with me. Scene 30. Voices spoke below him in the parlour, but Aaron couldn't hear their words. He stood in the doorway of their little secret corridor and stared out at his sister Jordina's body on their balcony. Her dark eyes were wide and unseeing, but at the same time she stared right at him. She was dead. His sister was dead, killed by these rebels. She'd landed at a funny angle, with one arm up buried underneath her, the other flung back over her head. With her limbs at odd angles, like they were, it looked as if she'd broken every bone in her body. He knew she was dead, and so wouldn't be feeling anything, but in his shock he desperately wanted to go to her and make her comfortable. Minna had escaped out through the black back tunnels with the girl. It instructed Aaron to bring the others to one of their old buildings once the rebels were dead. Obviously, Minna had underestimated their enemy. Aaron couldn't sense any other RA left in the building, just him and these rebels. He was afraid. He wanted to escape the building and find Minna, but he knew it wasn't likely that he'd be able to do so without being killed. He was only safe at that moment because of his odd talent for not being sensed by other Psi unless he chose to be. He gave his sister one last lingering glance and stepped back into the hidden corridor behind the playroom. He'd be safe in there for a little while. The secret passage entrance was hidden from immediate view by the architecture of the main upstairs hall. At first glance, it looked a little like someone had widened that end of the hall to let in more light from the windows. The door was hidden around the corner where the hall opened out. It was simply smart design. Aaron had always liked how all of the secret parts of Minna's house were put in plain view, and were only really hidden to people who didn't stop and look carefully around them. The passage was narrow, dark, and very dusty. It was lined on both walls with thick psi-suppressant stone, so it made a nice place to sit in the shadows and get away from the psychic noise of the world. Aaron was technically a telepath, but he was mostly only a receiver. He could hear the noise of the city for many kilometres around him, but couldn't do much more than that. He'd never really learned how to block the noise off, so having a place to go and be alone, just with his own thoughts, was nice. Minna allowed him to go to the passage any time he needed a break. Despite his frightening hostility, Minna had treated Aaron better than some of the other RA, and as such had earned Aaron's respect and obedience, even if he sometimes regretted it. He had two choices. One was to hide in the darkness and wait for the rebels to leave, but Minna would probably call him a coward and a traitor for not fighting. The other option was that he could try to defend the house and risk being killed. Aaron sat down in front of the secret panel that led into the back of the playroom. He couldn't go up against those on the ground floor. There were at least 3 of them. The 2 in the playroom didn't know about the secret door, and the surprise would give him quite an advantage. The 2 against 1 was still bad odds. He sat at the door, frowning deeply. If he showed Minna cowardice, Minna would probably kill him. But if he attacked their enemy, it was quite likely they'd kill him too. He sighed and got to his feet. It was better to die bravely than to die with shame. Scene break. When consciousness found Zack again, it felt like his entire body was one big throbbing bruise. He groaned and cracked his eyes open. A long face with dark eyes and hair smiled down at him. Welcome back to the world of the living, kid. How you feel? Zack only managed to moan in reply. Barna chuckled. That bad, huh? Well, lad, you did good. I'm impressed. You certainly got more stones than I had at your age. Do you think you can stand? Sure, he mumbled, and started to sit up. His body ached all over, and not just where he'd been nicked by bullets. With a little help from Barna, Zack managed to get to his feet. The taller man pulled Zack's uninjured arm over his shoulder and steered him towards the door. The others are downstairs, Barna turned suddenly, pushing Zack down with one quick shove. As Zack landed, he heard 2 gunshots go off in quick succession. He rolled onto his stomach and looked around. Barna lay on his back nearby, not moving. Crawling up to him, Zack touched his neck to find a pulse. Barna was breathing, but had a nasty bloody gunshot wound in his chest. Further across the room was another body. Grabbing Barna's gun, Zack clambered to his feet to make sure the shooter was dead. The man lay in front of an open wall panel, a secret door, the lines of which had been masked by a particularly wide painted tree trunk. Man's black eyes were still open, but as Zack got closer, he saw a bloody wound in the middle of his forehead. Barna was definitely a good shot. The door behind him opened and Zack spun around with Barna's gun, aiming at the figure that stepped inside. Nama dropped his weapon. "It's just me. You all right?" Zack swallowed. "Barna's hurt bad." Scene 31. Nalana ran after her Misha and Nama, lugging one of the heavy medical cases under one arm. Nama's fear was thick in the air, and she found that it was slowly leaking into her. He hadn't said who was hurt or how bad, just that they needed to run. The long gravel driveway ended at a pair of high metal gates, which were wide open. A massive white stone house rose above her as they ran towards it. It seemed overbearing, as if it was looking down at her with a contemptuous hatred. She ran through a blackened front entrance and stopped there. Many bodies lay haphazardly on the white marble parlour floor. All of the bodies were Ronin. "Nala, go in there." Nama pointed to a room on her right. "Ren, upstairs with me." She nodded and turned away as Nama led them towards the nearby stairwell. The room off to the side had fewer bodies, but was almost completely ruined by mould and age, scorched marks on the walls. 2 bodies were stacked on top of each other in one corner. In the middle of the room lay 2 of their people. Talon sat between them, one hand on each of them to stem their bleeding. "Tay?" she said uncertainly. The face that turned to look up at her was afraid and lost. Talon's dark blue eyes were red and shimmered with a line of tears. She dropped down in front of Tay and leaned over to check injuries. Asha was unconscious, but breathing evenly. She was shot in the shoulder, and as Nalana lifted his hand from the wound to have a look, she figured that the bullet had probably broken Asha's collarbone. The new recruit, a Ronin woman who Nala had only met a couple of times, had a pretty bad stomach wound. Her breathing was rapid, and her dark face was oddly grey. "Keep holding pressure, Tay." Nalana shuffled on her knees to Lalan's head and placed both of her hands on the woman's shoulders. The healing energy flowed out of her hands immediately and pulsed into the pain and injury. Through her senses, she felt that the bullet was very close to a major artery. Lalan wasn't lost yet, but if they moved her and the bullet pierced the thin arterial lining, she would bleed out very quickly. "We need Ren down here as soon as possible." Her healing ability couldn't do a lot for their type of injury, except support peripheral body systems and lift away some of the pain. But she could at least ease the stress on their bodies while they waited for Ren. She shuffled sideways and placed her hands on Asha. Under her fingers, broken bone throbbed back at her angrily. Asha's face, which had been screwed up from the pain, relaxed somewhat as the flow of buzzing healing energy moved into the bullet wound. She sensed that small pieces of metal shrapnel had spread out and embedded themselves in the underlying bone and muscle of Asha's shoulder. But despite the damage, Asha was in better condition than Lalan. "Is Asha?" Talon's voice wobbled and trailed off. "She's okay." She looked up, making sure to get eye contact with him. "The bullet has broken her collarbone and shattered on impact, but she's fairly stable for now." The energy in her hands shut off and she went to the medical bag with supplies. She sighed. "What's going on upstairs?" "Barna." Talon shook his head. "It didn't look good." Her bottom lip twitched and she nodded. Scene break. Zack leaned over, using his weight to maintain pressure on Barna's chest wound. He snuffled, but couldn't stop the tears that ran down his face. Barna had saved him. He should have sensed it. If he had, then Bana would probably not be dying there in that ridiculous room. He knew why he hadn't felt the man, because he could only sense those things that would hurt him, not others, but he still felt as if it was his fault. He should have somehow been better, and now Bana was dying. If he died before Wren got to them, that smart, mischievous young girl, Gusa, would be an orphan. Zach's whole body ached, and the longer he sat there putting pressure on the wound, the worse the pain in his body got. But he wouldn't let his own injury stop him from doing everything he could for Bana. The big wooden door at the front of the room opened. He looked up at Wren and Nama. Wren's grey eyes were sympathetic. Zay knelt down in front of Zach. Warm, gentle fingers lifted Zach's hands from the terrible chest wound. Wren carefully cleared the bullet hole of torn material and placed a hand either side of the mess. Zach sensed the old androgen's energy pulse out of him into Bana. Healing energy had an undertone of white static to it. Zach had often wondered how seeing the future had anything to do with the body's ability to heal quickly like that, but no one had been able to answer him. It was just one of the many mysteries of time Saigens. Zach's hands were sticky with blood, so he wiped at his tears with the crook of his elbow. Under Wren's hands, Bana's breathing didn't change. It was still quick and shallow. His face was very pale. He leaned forward. Bana's breathing should have changed already. That was always the first thing that happened when Wren healed someone. Zach glanced up at Nama and swallowed. He didn't know what it meant, but it couldn't be good. Panic started to rise inside of Zach. What if Bana dies? Calm down, young Zach. Wren's deep, rumbling voice was quiet. It's okay. Bana let out a long, deep breath. And then his breathing became even, as if he was sleeping. Between Wren's large, wrinkled hands, the skin parted, and Zach could see the head of a bullet come out and roll away onto the folds of Bana's jacket. Another 2 pieces of metal pushed out after the first, and the tension in Bana's limbs released. Peace came to the older man's face, and Zach understood that his new friend would be okay. Zach closed his eyes and lowered his chin. Abik Hashem, thank Nira. Stay with him, Zach. Nama stood in the doorway. Wren, we've got 2 more people to help downstairs. Wren stood up again with a little grunt of pain from their bad knees. They dropped a comforting hand on Zach's hair, and Zach felt a little calmer inside himself. We'll send Alana up to you. You've got a few severe burns that could use some attention.